Two siblings are comfortably on board a small Cessna airplane. They're due to reach South St. Paul. The pilot receives ATC clearances and is informed of the weather conditions before they take off, and while in the air, he receives further instructions, which he also acknowledges. But only 4 minutes into the flight, they're moments away from crashing into a 2-story brick home whose residents are fast asleep. The pilot has evidently now lost control. But with no reported mechanical issues, what exactly caused a routine Minnesota flight to take such a dark turn? This is the complete story of the widely questioned Hermantown plane crash. It's October 1st, 2022. Alyssa Schmidt and Matthew Schmidt, along with their friend and pilot Tyler Fretland, are preparing to board their airplane for a return flight. Earlier that day, they had flown from South St. Paul to Duluth, Minnesota to attend a wedding. Now, nearly 12 hours later, they're about to head back to South St. Paul, leaving Duluth International Airport. The time is 11:45 at night, so they'll soon be boarding for a late 70-minute flight home. The aircraft for the journey is a Cessna 172S. It's a 4-seat, single-engine, high-wing aircraft that's also immensely popular. It's widely favored by both student and private pilots due to its ease of handling and reliability. This particular airplane had been manufactured in 2002. Its maintenance records show regular inspections. For instance, a certificate dated the 30th of September, just a day prior to the flight, states its engine and propellers to be in airworthy condition. Similarly, Fretland himself conducted a brief inspection upon his arrival back to the airplane. And, as we now know, examinations following the incident have echoed the same message. There were no mechanical malfunctions during the flight. On paper, the Cessna was in safe hands. Fretland was a certified pilot with almost 650 hours of flight experience. A review of his logbook shows that he'd performed well over 800 landings and had even provided nearly 300 hours of training to other pilots as an authorized instructor. He was also instrument rated and had spent exactly 7.9 hours flying under instrument conditions. Now, this is of particular importance because these also happen to be the conditions on the night in question. In aviation, instrument meteorological conditions, abbreviated as IMC, are weather conditions that require pilots to rely mainly on airplane instruments for navigation. This is due to low visibility and heavy cloud cover. So, while pilots typically fly using visual flight rules, these conditions put them under instrument flight rules instead. But what was more relevant on that day was actually a subcategory of instrument flight rules called low instrument flight rules. According to the Federal Aviation Administration, low instrument flight rules must be adhered to when ceilings are less than 500 feet above ground level or visibility is less than 1 mile. This is the most restrictive flight category that can prevail, and as a result, flights under such conditions are challenging even for the most experienced pilots. The weather at Duluth International Airport around the time of departure was indeed far from ideal. Winds were blowing from the east at 10 knots, with gusts up to 19 knots, and visibility was limited to 5 miles due to mist. The ceiling was particularly concerning, with overcast clouds sitting just 200 feet above the ground. The temperature was 9 degrees Celsius, close to the dew point at 8 degrees Celsius, which had created conditions ripe for fog formation. If we recall the criteria for low instrument flight rules, we see that the conditions on that day firmly qualify. The visibility of 5 miles was above the threshold, but the low ceiling of 200 feet was on its own sufficient to make the classification. In accordance with that, the National Weather Service had reported low instrument flight rules to be in effect for the duration of the flight. At this point, given the conditions surrounding the flight, it's easy to assume that there were at least some signs of imminent danger. In real time, however, there was little reason for any party to fixate on them, and let me explain why. Firstly, these conditions weren't unexpected. They didn't come out of the blue. During a formal interview, Zayas, who was one of the traffic controllers directing the flight, stated that the weather was typical of Duluth and that it was normal for conditions to significantly change beyond a 5-mile radius. And secondly, Fretland had the experience under his belt to be broadly considered fit to tackle such weather. He'd done it numerous times before and had undergone nearly 70 hours of specialized training in the form of simulated exercises. Therefore, due to these factors, there was understandably little concern prior to the incident, especially outside the cockpit. At around 11:03 p.m., the Cessna's engines are started and ready. Fretland and his passengers are still on the ramp, preparing for taxiing. Fretland requests an instrument flight rules clearance.
Duluth ground, November 262 Tango Alpha. We are at the Monaco ramp, looking for IFR.
He's already aware of the weather conditions, so he knows this will be an instrument-only flight. A moment later, the traffic controller clears the pilot for an IFR route directly to South St. Paul Municipal Airport. He also instructs him to climb to an altitude of 6,000 feet. In the same transmission, control assigns a radio frequency and a squawk code.
So 2 Tango Alpha cleared to the South St. Paul Airport via direct. Climb and maintain 6,000, departure frequency 125.45, squawk 4220.
Alright, cleared to the South St. Paul Airport via direct, climb and maintain 6,000, 125.425, and I missed the squawk code.
2 Tango Alpha 4220, 4220 for the squawk, readback is correct and advise ready to taxi.
The pilot correctly reads back most of the instructions. However, as you may have caught on, he hears the wrong frequency. What's more is that the controller doesn't correct his readback. Upon reflection, the controller explained that having the frequency on speaker instead of on headset may have been why he failed to catch it. Nevertheless, this error wasn't particularly significant to the incident, but for the pilot, perhaps it foreshadowed a phenomenon that was yet to truly set in. The system checks are now over with. The pilot taxis to runway 9 via taxiway Alpha. The two passengers are well seated, likely winding down after a long day. At this point, control provides more key information.
2 Tango Alpha, runway 9er, taxi via Alpha. Right now, looking at about a half a mile viz. Base is reported 250 feet AGL. Just for what it's worth, you might be an IMC for a while.
Alright, via Alpha, and it'll probably be an IMC for a while, thank you.
This back and forth reaffirmed the pilot being aware of not only the conditions, but also him having to remain in them for a significant portion of the climb. The pilot is now holding short of runway 9. Control clears him for takeoff and instructs him to turn right and proceed directly towards South St. Paul. They also provide him with wind and runway visibility information. The pilot acknowledges and begins his takeoff roll. He advances the throttle and accelerates down the runway. By 11:12 p.m., the Cessna is airborne. The plane enters the clouds at around 250 feet, and nearly all ground lights vanish from sight. The pilot initiates a right turn in accordance with control's instructions. He does so while climbing to about 1,750 feet above mean sea level. However, this was an early turnout. It was slightly odd that the pilot chose to turn that soon in those conditions. This was perhaps the first real sign of potentially impaired judgment, but for the controllers, it did seem like a standard turn. There was no fixed expectation for turnouts when departing runway 9, nor were the pilots restricted to anything specific. What happened next, though, was unexpected in every sense of the word. The pilot fails to maintain the correct course. His plane enters a tight, uncommanded left turn, closely resembling a teardrop pattern. He makes this turn while climbing to 2,800 feet above mean sea level and continues at 360 degrees until the plane is on a track of about 270 degrees. Inside the aircraft, the passengers feel the unnatural motion of the turn. Discomfort was likely setting in. The rear seat passenger had even recorded the takeoff, capturing the initial climb and cloud entry, but stopped recording shortly after. This video has not been publicly released. Meanwhile, the ATC is in contact with the pilot. Only minutes after takeoff, local control had transferred him to departure control, which is standard procedure.
Tango Alpha, contact departure, good night.
Contact via departure, 2 Tango Alpha, 1 second.
Cessna 262 Tango Alpha, departure here. Cessna 2 Tango Alpha, contact departure.
Contact via departure, 2 Tango Alpha.
More accurately, it was an attempt to transfer him. While the pilot was responsive, he failed to switch despite multiple requests, which was a red flag for control. Immediately after the deviating left turn, the Cessna had begun to descend. The pilot likely feels strong conflicting sensations about the plane's altitude and direction. This had all to do with the absence of visual cues outside. The pilot naturally believes the plane to be level or in a controlled turn, when it's actually entering a steeper, more hazardous trajectory. Following the pilot's transmission, the plane continues to descend with increasing speed. At this point, the alarm bells are ringing for control. They quickly spot the aircraft not maintaining its expected climb to 6,000 feet and urge the pilot to confirm their status.
Cessna 2 Tango Alpha, I'm showing you're descending down to 1900, verify climbing.
For 2 Tango Alpha Duluth, are you still on? 2 Tango Alpha Duluth.
2 Tango Alpha Duluth approach, out of here.
The pilot does not respond. By 11:17 p.m., the worst had already happened. Tragically, the Cessna continues its descent until it impacts power lines and strikes a 2-story house in Hermantown, Minnesota, with the aircraft in a left bank of approximately 40 degrees. This impact angle, combined with the descent rate, leaves little to no chance of survival for those on board. For ATC, the inability to regain contact serves as a crushing confirmation of the flight's outcome. Emergency services are promptly notified. The crash caused substantial damage to the house, with the plane passing through 2 bedrooms on the second floor. But fortunately enough, it narrowly missed the 2 residents who were asleep at the time of impact. They woke up to an airplane wheel next to their bed, a hole in the front of their roof, and all of their belongings destroyed. Remarkably, they escaped with only minor scratches. Following a 2-year investigative period, the National Transportation Safety Board clarified the probable cause of the crash as a phenomenon that was apparent throughout the duration of the flight: spatial disorientation. This is the formal term that explains the conflicting sensation the pilot felt while navigating the plane. Good spatial orientation relies on sensory information. When the various types of sensory stimuli each vary, the result is a sensory mismatch and, in turn, spatial disorientation. At that point, you're unable to correctly interpret the aircraft's position and motion relative to the Earth. Humans are wired to trust their perceptual system, but when one part of it goes missing, particularly vision in our case, it ends up relaying the wrong signals. Just like the pilot on that day, no one is immune to these signals. Safety then simply becomes a matter of recognizing the situation and trusting your instruments instead. This is, of course, easier said than done. According to the FAA, up to 10% of all aviation accidents can be attributed to the phenomenon. But the question of why Fretland unfortunately succumbed to spatial disorientation still remains. Earlier in this video, we outlined the pilot's experience, which suggested anything but the outcome on that day. The investigation provides more context. What I'm about to tell you puts into perspective the more overpowering factors that contributed to the crash. According to the board, the pilot had flown with a student the day before the crash. Fretland reportedly admitted to a student that he felt a little nervous about the next day's flight under IFR conditions. He expressed not being confident in his instrument abilities despite having the hours, and it makes sense why. Of the 7.9 hours of actual instrument experience he had, only 0.3 of it was accumulated within the preceding 15 months. That's 18 minutes. Therefore, despite his overall numbers, Fretland actually lacked recent experience and the assertiveness he would have ideally needed. Similarly, it's important to recall that he was returning to the cockpit after a long day of activities, which makes the effect of fatigue very relevant. It's likely that having more energy would have improved his mental ability to catch on to his situation to at least some degree. These factors, of course compounded with the presence of extremely dark conditions, put the pilot in a vulnerable position with an increased risk of spatial disorientation. This story has real takeaways for pilots across the world. Many pilots consider the situation of inadvertently entering IMC to be particularly dangerous. And it's true, it's led to many, many accidents. But as we've seen today, the threat of spatial disorientation is just as real for flights starting out in IMC. Comprehensive instrument training is critically important, and once that time has been invested, maintaining those comfort levels is essential. The Hermantown crash is a sobering reminder of the challenges faced in aviation and the consequences of the smallest of lapses. The loss of 3 lives, along with the emotional impact of those in the home, is a heartbreaking outcome. One way to honor those affected is by continuing to learn, and I hope this video helped you do just that. If it did, make sure to check out my other videos, and I thank you for your support.